With God's blessing, we taught the Israelis a lesson they will never forget. We destroyed the Merkava, which they said could defeat the Palestinian resistance and crush the Palestinian people.
Israel's Merkava tank was designed after the harsh lesson learned in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. The Israelis had lost hundreds of tanks to Soviet-made anti-tank missiles. The Israelis vowed never again. When the first Merkava tank was released in the late 70s, many military experts considered it to be among the best protected tanks in the world. But at the turn of the 21st century, it was difficult to predict where Israel's main battle tank would next be used. Israel had made peace with Egypt in 1979. The Iraqi army had been crushed in the 1991 Gulf War. Israel had signed peace accords with the Jordanians and the Palestinians. Then, in late 2000, the Second Palestinian Intifada erupted. The Merkava was soon deployed in support of Israeli military operations in the West Bank and Gaza. The tactics were heavy-handed and, according to some Israelis, ineffective.
You can't reach guerrilla movements in the narrow streets of the refugee camps. Even if you have a modern tank like the Merkava, they just can't maneuver. What can a tank do in front of a child carrying a stone or a Molotov cocktail?
The use of large-scale tanks in civilian applications actually creates a great sense of antagonism and hostility. This alienates, this makes people angry, and promotes in them a desire to find other ways to hit back.
The Palestinians in the occupied territories had learned new ways to fight. There were still the young boys throwing stones, which had characterized the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987. But increasingly, the Israelis found themselves facing a new generation of Palestinian guerrillas. This new generation of guerrillas had lived under the yoke of Israeli occupation. They were familiar with Israeli military operations, and they used all means at their disposal to obtain crucial information on fighting their enemy.
There are Israeli websites showing photos and other information about the Merkava. They are proud of it and want to show it off. We visited these sites and learned of its strong and its weak points.
The belly of the tank is not as well armored as the sides or the front. This is the weakest part, the belly.
In home workshops like these, Palestinians work to produce weapons. The aim, to attack the Merkava.
So explosives were available both in West Bank and in Gaza. The exercise was really to foresee and to estimate the positioning in which to put the explosives and to find some effective way for initiating the explosives.
In Gaza, one paramilitary faction, the Salahuddin Brigade, took on the challenge of striking at the Merkava. We met the fighters who explained how they planned and executed a classic ambush along this road close to what was once the Jewish settlement of Netzarim in February 2002.
We carefully observed the Merkava for 2 months, and one day we decided to attack it. We planted 2 mines on the road, a small one of 30 kilos and a larger one of 120 kilos. The small mine targeted a military convoy which was coming out of the Israeli settlement of Netzarim. This exploded, and as we had predicted, a Merkava tank was sent to rescue the convoy. When it approached, we detonated the larger mine. the tank was cut into pieces and the crew killed.
This was the first Merkava to be destroyed in Gaza. The Israelis were shocked. The Palestinian guerrillas saw this attack as a significant step forward in their resistance to Israeli occupation.
Praise be to God. We were happier than ever before. The Palestinian people were now confident that this monster, the Merkava, could be destroyed.
Another Palestinian faction in Gaza took inspiration from this attack on the Merkava. 7 months after the first attack, the Al-Quds Brigade targeted a Merkava tank which was patrolling the Rafah border area in southern Gaza. At the exact location, they told us how they carried out their attack in September 2002.
We were very jealous of the fact that other groups had destroyed the Merkava, and so we decided to try to destroy one too. We only had an old RPG-7, but we decided to use it against the Merkava, as we knew that the back door was one of its weak points.
The opportunity came when the tank turned and its back door was facing us. We fired the RPG, which penetrated the back door. The shells inside the tank exploded, creating a massive bang.
The blast was so huge that massive fragments of metal from the destroyed tank scattered across the area, smashing holes in the border wall the Israelis had built. An area that had been frequently shot at by the Israeli army now bore the shrapnel marks from a destroyed Merkava.
We celebrated and distributed sweets to all our relatives and friends. At first the Merkava was like a miracle, but now it's something normal, like any other armored vehicles.
Other Merkava tanks were targeted by Palestinian militants. A week after the strike by the Al-Quds Brigade, another Merkava was blown up by a landmine close to Al-Mughazi refugee camp. The explosion was so powerful that to this day the soil still remains discolored on the exact spot where the tank was destroyed. These Palestinian shepherd boys showed us what they said were remnants from the destroyed tank. Such successful strikes against the Merkava in Gaza, though exceptional, nevertheless demonstrated that the legendary tank was not invincible. A chink in Israel's armor had been detected. Hezbollah was quick to pick up on these lessons when Israel invaded Lebanon in the summer of 2006. Like the Palestinians, Hezbollah made it their aim to damage what was still a powerful symbol of Israel's technological might. As in 1982, the Israelis decided to spearhead their incursion into Lebanon with tanks. And as in 1982, the Merkava was the principal instrument through which Israel implemented its version of Blitzkrieg, a lightning war in which the Israeli army sought to win all of its battles quickly, decisively, and with the fewest possible casualties. Israel's major ground assault into Lebanon was launched on 2 fronts. Neither of them was an obvious choice for tanks.
The terrain in the south is ideal guerrilla country. It is hilly, it is often well covered with trees and undergrowth. It has caves, it has tunnels. It was ideal territory for people who know the ground and understand the area very well, and extremely difficult for an invader who does not know the ground as well.
The Israelis first crossed the border from the Metula settlement and advanced through this valley beneath the village of Al-Khiyam. Hezbollah guerrillas, hiding in the surrounding hills and villages, fired their anti-tank missiles at the Israeli tanks advancing below.
That incursion of tanks reached about 3.5 kilometers before that was halted by missile attack.
Hezbollah was using the latest Metis and Kornet anti-tank missiles. Manufactured in Russia, the missiles had the ability to pierce even the heavy armor of the Merkava. After losing several tanks and sustaining casualties, the Israelis chose to advance via a different route. This second thrust took them through this area, called Wadi al-Ahjar.
It was a little, small wadi, narrow valley, that curved like a snake. The Israeli tanks got trapped in this small wadi, and many were destroyed by Hezbollah. And of course, find it very difficult to bypass or get past either the lead tanks that had been destroyed or some of the rear tanks that had been destroyed. And that left them in a very difficult situation, and they had to retreat.
Back in Israel itself, Israelis were still coming under attack from Hezbollah rockets. After 33 days of war, Israel had failed to achieve its goals of destroying Hezbollah and winning back 2 of its soldiers captured at the very beginning of the latest fighting. Hezbollah claimed victory.
المقاومة اليوم تملك أكثر من 20,000 صاروخ.
Here in Israel, the mood was somber. Serious questions were raised about the level of the army's preparedness and performance. The government set up a commission of inquiry to investigate and draw lessons from Israel's failures in its 2006 war in Lebanon. According to the Israelis, of the 370 Merkava tanks involved in the war, 49 of them had been hit by Hezbollah. God's chariot was not living up to its name or its reputation. Beyond its technical and military capabilities, Israel's main battle tank, the Merkava, is a potent weapon of psychological warfare. It is a statement of Israel's military power and a symbol of Israel's determination to dominate the Arabs. Israelis were only too keen to publicize this power. Promotional videos extolling the Merkava's benefits were posted on the internet. Yet Israel's enemies also proved media savvy. The Al-Manar television station, owned and run by Hezbollah, broadcast its own edited version of the Israeli videos. Except Hezbollah's message about the Merkava was wholly different. During the 2006 war in Lebanon, Israel targeted Al-Manar TV station in an attempt to stop its broadcasts. Ali Shuaib is a correspondent for Al-Manar.
Hello.
Here in the town of Nabatia, he showed us the building in which he used to work before it was destroyed by an Israeli aerial attack in the 2006 war. Hezbollah had declined to give us an interview with its fighters. But Ali Shuaib was able to provide an insight into the mindset of these fighters. During the war, he embedded himself with a Hezbollah guerrilla unit.
It was a matter of determination. Hezbollah fighters would not fire their anti-tank missiles until they were 100% sure they could strike a Merkava. Some Merkavas were destroyed from only 20 meters away.
The issue was not the technology of the missiles, as the Israelis claimed after the war. The issue was determination, creativity, and innovation in the battlefield.
Even some Israelis believe the mental qualities displayed by Hezbollah guerrillas proved an advantage despite the fact they were outgunned.
If you are handling a situation in a battlefield when the Merkava is against some half Shahid, it's a problem. It's a matter of determination, not a matter of a well-designed tank, which the Merkava is.
Israel had years of experience fighting Hezbollah during its 22-year occupation of South Lebanon. Yet in the Merkava, the Israelis were still deploying a weapon originally designed in the 1970s for large-scale tank warfare between nation-states.
The Israelis used to rely on tanks because they manifested their prestige. But after the Lebanon War, this is not the case to the same extent. Israel's enemy today is not an army like that of Syria or Egypt, but rather guerrilla movements.
Guerrilla warfare usually pits a smaller force against a conventionally more powerful enemy, as in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq today. Hezbollah could not destroy the Israeli army, but in targeting the Merkava tank, it was sapping Israel's strength and morale in southern Lebanon.
With respect to resistance movements, they can never defeat their enemies, but they can exhaust them. All the major powers must realize that no matter how sophisticated their technology may become, the human factor can still defeat them.
Fighting on their own soil, the Hezbollah guerrillas possessed a sense of purpose, which some analysts feel Israel lacked.
When the Israeli soldier is defending Israel itself, he has a motivation, because he is defending his land. But when he goes to fight in Lebanon, Sinai, the Golan, he is an invader, and therefore doesn't have the same motivation.
Israeli troops on the ground didn't really believe in the project. There was no great sort of sense of mission or moral duty. This was, in a sense, a punishment operation.
Right now, I think that some Israelis are not sure what is the aim, why we are fighting for.
Such uncertainty about Israel's aims is casting doubt on the very basics of Israeli military doctrine and the continued use of the Merkava. Drawing lessons from the 2006 war in Lebanon, Israel is revising its military tactics. Its version of blitzkrieg has become outdated in today's battlefield. Israeli soldiers are today training for warfare that will rely less on tanks and more on infantry. These exercises are conducted on terrain similar to that of southern Lebanon. Other environments are also simulated. This is a mock Arab town, specially constructed by the Israeli army for military exercises. These soldiers are practicing street fighting. The setting is similar to that of towns in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. After more than 3 decades of research, investment, and development, the Merkava project is now at a crossroads.
There's been a debate in Israel over the last few years about whether we should continue to manufacture the Merkava or not. We spend a lot of money on the Merkava, and Israel is a small country.
Military analysts estimate that $6.5 billion has been spent on the development and continued upgrading of the Merkava tank since the 1970s. Yuri Milstein is one of the critics of the philosophy behind the Merkava tank. He believes such spending is an unjustified extravagance.
The United States offered to sell us their Abrams tank, but the Minister of Defense and Israel Tal refused this offer. They chose instead to continue investing in the Merkava project.
But supporters of the Merkava do not want Israel to be dependent on anyone, even its closest ally, the United States. These supporters argue that the Merkava remains an essential part of Israel's military arsenal.
It's our baby. Why to kill it?
Beyond the debate about the costs and politics of the Merkava program, lie other issues. Questions have been raised about whether Israel's main battle tank is compromising rather than consolidating Israel's long-term security.
There would be an incursion, often accompanied by tanks, into a West Bank town like Jenin. And then at the end of the operation, Israel would come out and they would say, well, that's been a success. There were 10 terrorists in Jenin, and we've killed 6, and now there are only 4 left. And I would go and talk to the people in Jenin, and they say, well, you know, before this operation, there were about 10 terrorists in Jenin, and the Israelis came in and killed them, and now there are 24 terrorists in Jenin.
You are not supposed to use tanks against human beings. You are not supposed to use tanks against guerrillas who are waiting in the bushes. If you want to use tanks, use it against tanks. This is the only way to succeed.
The Merkava has become an emblem of Israel, and the debate about its future is emblematic of the difficult choices Israeli society is confronting.
It's correct to think of Merkava as a symbol of Israel. Israel as a country wanted to model itself on the Merkava, to be strong on the outside and have a population living in comfort on the inside. And like the Merkava, to be ruthless and accurate in its ability to destroy its enemies.
The tank, like the wall the Israelis are building around the West Bank, epitomizes Israel's attempt to ensure its own security. The danger is that the pursuit of military domination and secure isolation is ultimately unattainable, and may in fact preclude any chance of achieving peace.
There is another critique of the Merkava, if I can put it that way, which is really about using military machinery to achieve what one might hope would be done through conciliation or discussion or negotiation or diplomacy. The energy that had been put into developing this piece of military technology had been used, even a fraction of it, to sort of think about other ways of, doing conciliation. It would be helpful.
One Israeli who knows all about the need for reconciliation is Arilova Eliav. As a young man, he fought in the First Arab-Israeli War to establish the State of Israel. In later years, he became less of a militant and more interested in seeking peace. He still believes that diplomacy and concession are the only way to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict and sow the seeds of peace.
Having a strong army, yes, sure enough, but start talking and come to a compromise. There is no, the essence of peace is a compromise. It's the very essence of peace.
As in the past, Israel will continue to adapt its fighting techniques and upgrade its weapons in the belief that its security lies in military strength. God's chariot, the Merkava, has failed to provide this security. The question is whether any weapon or fighting technique can give the Israeli people the security they crave, or whether there are other ways to secure lasting peace.